No, and I think we should get to the clip. But all I'll say is this: is to maybe somebody who is like a Jimmy Dore listener who's come across this, at some point or another. Look, the criticism is that the Democratic Party is a capitalist party with the interest of capital at the heart of the engine of that political movement, I agree with you. If the question is that we need to be building independent working class power, I am with you. If the demand is that too many people on the progressive left are too willing to cater to those in power, I am here with you. There are plenty of people who are making these critiques out there. The difference between what you're going to get at the Jimmy Dore show and what you'll get on Left Reckoning is we try to root these things in reality and in actually existing movements, and are humble enough to recognize where we are strong and where we are weak. And where we are weak, question, how do we get to the place where we can be strong and do the things that absolutely need to be done to be able to change this country and change politics in this country? The fact is that that's going to take a lot of sober-minded analysis, and most importantly, actually getting engaged in the real world, in the actual class struggle and the fights that are going on, something that Jimmy Dore has shown time and time again that he's uninterested in even supporting labor. Like he spends a lot of time getting worked up about the squad. When does this guy out here covering these labor movements? In fact, he spends a lot of time denigrating burgeoning labor movements in this country. And I think that that's extremely unhelpful. So,
yeah, I mean, he went after the teachers union for being too concerned with health during COVID, during a surge that ended up being one of the ones that was most damaging to kids. He went after the Teamsters because they weren't supportive of the truckers' strike and said it was a right-wing ploy. I just think that's important context, because he's going to go at Joe Biden for rightly, or Joe Biden with regards to what happened with the rail strike last winter, right? Like that's part of Jimmy's repertoire now. But just like when he was supporting a candidate, Tulsi, that wasn't supportive of single payer, and then it became now a purity principle after that was off the table, but after that primary was over, and Tulsi, by the way, endorsed Joe Biden.
Look, if he was serious about coming at Biden and supporting the labor movement, I mean, there's a big question and test that you have there. Where was he when a significant amount of coal miners in Alabama, in what's quote unquote Trump country, a lot of those people who did support Trump, not all of them, but some of them did, right? Were out there fighting for their lives against one of the most entrenched capitalist organizations in this country, right? You can make plenty of critiques of Joe Biden. In fact, we did on this channel. In fact, I did in Jacobin magazine writing about this. You see, there's a selective choice that he makes about what things he wants to jump into and also when he wants to jump into these fights. And that becomes rather telling. But I think there's like way too much preamble because we got some stuff to go through. We're going to spend some time on this, folks. We usually don't do these more extended watch throughs, but I mean, this one is, if you're completely unfamiliar with this, or if you haven't tuned into any of Jimmy Dore stuff, you're about to enter into like a funhouse mirror of a very deranged and strange ideology that he's been developing on his program with his audience. Here again, with an independent socialist candidate running for president, somebody who supports the vast majority of our goals for politics. But yeah, let's see a little bit of this.
And, folks will be familiar with our previous coverage of this. We come in on a clip of Cornel responding to Bernie Sanders and, why he supports Joe Biden. And that's fundamentally where Jimmy's pissed, is because he goes against that narrative in an amicable way. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Did you see what he named this video?
I did. Yeah. Is he trying to lose? I mean, there's a few of them. There's the title and the thumbnail, and then there's
the long
the
one from the 45-minute one. Let me get it. I'm going to pull up just so I don't get it wrong. Ready? The long one that he has is, God damn it. Sorry, I had this up and I deleted all my tabs a second ago. He says Cornel West gives 45-minute Joe Biden endorsement.
Right. Yeah. And it's all, yeah, right. Exactly. And I mean, this is the thing I've been going on about, is Jimmy, he wants to act like, oh yeah, he has this, I think, the more reasonable position, which is that, okay, there's fascism everywhere. Joe Biden is a certain part of that. And to an extent, we'll see like Cornel West is agreeable to this. But Jimmy actually wants to say that Joe Biden's the real fascist here. and Trump isn't remotely fascist in comparison. And you'll notice a bit of waffling on those two positions, and Cornel West takes issue with the latter.
Again, he's fearful of the neo-fascism of Trump.
So when my what I would say to you here, and this is a big point, and I'm trying to impress upon you going forward, that when you do that, you sound a little bit like Joe Biden, and what you're doing is you're giving a pass to Bernie Sanders and anybody else for voting lesser of two evils.
That part, I find this is where my fundamental problem with Jimmy is this is a vote shaming operation. I don't care if people vote green. I don't care if people vote Democrat. And I think the people who are constantly making an obstacle out of people who just vote Democrat for harm reduction purposes, I just don't understand that strategy. Maybe it makes sense to some people. I don't get it. I don't get antagonizing those people and saying, actually, no. And we'll see. I guess can let Jimmy elaborate a little bit more of it, because he goes on here for a bit. There's a lot of talking at a presidential candidate.
The Democrats' message in their campaign. And so now people can dismiss your candidacy and say, well, we got to worry about the neo-fascism of Trump, as if Joe Biden isn't worse, which he is. He's a bigger fascist. And he just crushed a union strike on the railroad, which is the definition of fascism. He's now trying to save around with two nuclear powers.
I'm just going to say this, like, as somebody who not only... Jesus Christ, like the criticism and the anger that was directed at the President Joe Biden for his role in that, we came at him hard, but also for the members of the squad who lined up and supported that breaking of the railroad strike, we came at them hard.
Yep.
The issue is not bringing that up. What is absolutely ludicrous, what is absolutely ridiculous, is to sit here and act like Donald Trump, the billionaire real estate guy from New York City, would not also crush a railroad strike. You think, what is this? We saw what a Trump presidency was. Was this a time when unions were thriving because Trump was putting up a bunch of like sensitive people on the NLRB to protect union rights in this country? No. Look, you can criticize Joe Biden for his fakeness when he says he's the most pro-union president ever, right? Without also saying Trump probably wouldn't have crushed it. Trump absolutely would have. Trump absolutely would have crushed that strike immediately.
Because if you follow up on this whole sick days thing, and again, like, the reason we haven't talked about this as more of like a propaganda issue is like, so the IBEW says, we a few months ago, thanks Joe Biden, we got our sick days finally working, behind the scenes. And part of me is like, I wish it was ahead in front of the scenes, so it would be a lesson to everyone, right? And instead of piecemeal, certain unions getting sick days, a certain amount of sick days is the full amount we need. Right, like we haven't covered that as much, but there's a reason. Like the unions have a transactional relationship with the Democratic Party. It is one where the Democrats are absolutely not trustworthy. Obviously, we would obviously prefer they had a dictatorial relationship with that party. The Republicans clearly have an adversarial relationship with labor unions, and that is frankly. That's what guides how seriously I take this stuff. Like that's me. That is, to me, I think if someone votes in line with that and actually looks into like, okay, which unions are supporting which candidate, and which is why I love that the UAW is holding out to make that mean something, and that needs to increasingly mean something. But that's the guide, and so like just to invoke it and say actually it's the most fascist thing ever, like it's pretty fascist, but it's like pretty American fascist. Like it's the expansive version of the term fascism here.
War, nothing more important than that. And what he's doing in Ukraine, you know exactly what he's doing, right? So he's the worst warmonger in the world. 300,000 Ukrainians have already been slaughtered in this proxy war that was provoked by.
And look, like Trump funded Ukraine, and then he said he wasn't going to fund Ukraine. It wasn't because, oh, look, it's going to the Azov battalion. It was because he wanted them to investigate Joe Biden. So, like, again, there's a bipartisanness here that's been obscured by this sort of Biden's a real fascist.
We're going to have to be careful programmatically, because if we do this every minute, we're never going to get through this. But I will just say on the warmongering thing, like, we can do all the hypotheticals on Ukraine, and I think it's important to note, as you were just saying, that like, you know, all the funding and all those things that were going on were happening under Trump. One thing that we've been extremely critical of Joe Biden about, yeah, thank you for saying what I was about to say. Trump killed Soleimani. Trump almost brought us to the brink of war with Iran. And in a way that is so dangerous. And if you read the reporting, it was some of the most psychotic people in the world who were around Trump, literally having to talk Trump down from escalating even further from that. Now, Biden has continued these things by maintaining, keeping people like the IRGC on the terror list and things like that, things that we've been endlessly critical of Biden as well. But this kind of idea here that like we had 4 years of peace under Donald J. Trump, it's just like you have to operate with an internet mind, right? With the mind that like whatever the news cycle is pumping up is the only thing that exists, and you can say whatever you want about history. And I mean, we got to keep going because we can just nitpick over and over and over. But I think it's important because like this is where Jimmy Dore, I think, is so dangerous because like, you know, you can criticize Joe Biden for his militarism, you can criticize him for his anti-labor stuff, but he's sprinkling in this bizarre thing about Trump sort of being an alternative to that. No, Trump is a continuation of that. The reality of American politics is you have two parties, and in this case, two leaders who are very willing to maintain both of those kind of systems, American imperialism abroad and war and labor at home, right? We can argue about who's better, whatnot, right? That's the reality. But what Jimmy Dore does is not just say, oh, you know, these things are existing with both of these folks. He says that one of them is actually better. And like basing that off of like an incredible false reality with zero nuance, right? It's not even like the accelerationist, like, oh, it's not that bad. It's not as bad as people might say under Trump, right? Certainly not good, but it's not as bad as people say. It's actually saying that Donald Trump, it was something that he's not and has proven himself time and time to be opposed to all these things that Jimmy is saying that, that he's not a threat to.
So when do you think that when you say that about, when you call Donald Trump a neo-fascist and you don't say that about Joe Biden, what do you say when I tell you that you're undercutting your own campaign and you are propping up the Democratic message, which is that they are the lesser of two evil and you have to vote for Joe Biden so we don't have fascism. By the way, we already have fascism. As we all know, fascism is the joining of corporate and government to screw the worker. And that's exactly what Joe Biden, the Democrats, and Pete Buttigieg did. And so they will keep doing it, and they're not stopping it. And they're also for censorship, which is the hallmark of fascism. So this idea that Donald Trump is more of a fascist than Joe Biden undermines your own campaign. There's no doubt about that.
Now, look, I don't like the censorship powers of our major platforms. And I think there's certain things that should have been handled differently during the COVID pandemic. I think, you know, I would say more support. Maybe we should have expanded health insurance to people and stuff like that. Cornel West puts, I think, the whole idea of fascism is here into, I think, the terms that I would maybe start with before I started saying like corporate censorship of tweets.
Right, sorry, Matt. Just
yeah,
because it's one thing that like is also like endlessly frustrating, and I think there's a part of this that comes from a lot of people on the left, right? Predominantly progressives, but I also think a lot of people who consider themselves to be socialists are really bad at, which is supporting Joe Biden's attempt to torture Julian Assange for exposing American war crimes, right? And there is a lane there to make that criticism by people like Dore in those groups, because I think a lot of people are extremely timid on that today. But again, you can't talk about things like that and also say what you're saying about Trump, because Trump literally was trying to assassinate Julian Assange when he was the president of the United States. Trump didn't pardon Julian Assange. Trump didn't let this guy get out of the effective prison cell that he was in the Ecuadorian embassy. Trump and the CIA were spying, stealing Julian Assange's children's diapers and plotting ways that they could murder and kill this guy. You have to be on another planet to sit here and talk about this guy, in the way that Jimmy Dore is implying. I mean, it is so ludicrous, and it relies again on saying Joe Biden is bad and then shutting off the rest, shutting off any other information, because the easiest thing in the world to say is that Joe Biden and Donald Trump are bad. That's why Cornel West, by the way, is running president. So this whole thing is like, oh, by saying that Trump is bad, you're undercutting your argument. No, he's running against Trump, right? Like the implication here is that Jimmy Dore should be sort of sidling up. That Cornel West should be sort of sidling up to Donald Trump. Again, sort of reveals a little bit about your political orientation there.
Yeah.
And they're not stopping it, and they're also for censorship, which is the hallmark of fascism. So this idea that Donald Trump is more of a fascist than Joe Biden undermines your own campaign. There's no doubt about that. And so what I would encourage you to stop doing that. What do you say back?
No, we deeply disagree on that, though, brother. I don't think, and this is why I disagree with Nick too, that and I appreciate your advice here, cast in a respectful way, but we do, and I disagree with Brother Nick on this too, that
Brother Nick Brana, I think, of the People's Party, big time psycho. More on that later.
Man, I just got back from Mississippi. You know that. You know what the Jenkins and Parkins, the two brothers brutalized by the police. There at the church, the Klan still running wild, not just with votes, but terrorizing black folk. The goon squad finally got caught by the two lawyers, Brother Malik and Brother Trent. Now, what does that mean? That means that when you talk about fascism, you're talking not just about the rule of big money, not just the rule of big military, not just the rule of corporate power, so that it's oligarchic in essence, but you're also talking.
Now, what I think Cornel is doing is putting in stark terms compared to what Jimmy was defining as fascism, what he sees as fascism would do with the carceral state. Mm-hmm. What Jimmy Dore will take from this is, oh, you're talking about mass incarceration? Joe Biden did that. So not as any sort of reproach to what he's talking about.
Dictatorial rule, no elections, the elimination of dissident voices, and then the scapegoating of the most vulnerable, which could be immigrants, it could be workers, it could be black people, Jews, Arabs, and so forth. See, under Biden, what you have is a fascist dimension domestically, especially against black folk and others. You and I, the very fact that we're having this dialogue without being eliminated overnight, a fascist regime could completely call into question with the use of arbitrary power. That's what happens in the mass incarceration regime vis-a-vis poor black people and others, right? So that is the fascist dimension. Similarly, so in terms of militarism abroad, so that there's fascist elements, my brother, there's fascist dimensions. But with Trump, when you have calling into question transfer of power and so forth, that is not the same thing. And so that doesn't undermine my campaign at all. The campaign's about truth.
100% undermines your campaign. 100%. You're shooting yourself right in the dick before you even start. So that's just bad. You're getting bad advice. I don't know who's advising you, but they're giving you horrible advice.
January. I'm a free man. I'm a free man, brother.
So January.
But I want to.
Okay, and I want to. I'm not. We don't need to pull the video down. I just want to say this also gets to the heart of a lot of the animosity here, right? I actually think that Cornel West politics are too clear and articulate for Jimmy Dore to support him in the first place. But fundamentally, it's this last thing here, is that Cornel West is getting advice, and it's not coming from this fella who runs a YouTube show or a podcast. Yeah. In fact, it might be even worse that Cornel West is able to think for himself. Right? There's a big aspect to this, is that Jimmy is salty, and he was salty the second that Cornel West first announced with the People's Party, because Jimmy Dore thought he was going to get to run for president with the People's Party. Right? Remember all the stuff they were doing in support of that, and now he's mad.
I think he wanted Cornel to do the People's Party, right? But Jimmy, because first there was like
before Cornel, there was all of this, putting the toe in the water about a Jimmy Dore run for president,
Yeah, but it was like send us super chats telling
No, I
Jimmy
know it wasn't
Dore's-
serious, but it fueled his vanity, right? He would love
Yeah.
nothing more than to run like a foolish campaign for president, and then to sort of be overstepped by Cornel West, and then to be insulted yet again by Cornel West. This is, in Jimmy's mind,
and to be
by not
contradicted
bringing
about
that
this
Jimmy Dore not bringing him on as like the advisor, right?
Yeah. But it's interesting the stuff that he's pissed about. Like it's. I mean, well, let's let it play out a little bit more.
Your argument. I want to hear your argument as to.
But I gotta say, like this whole thing, like the Trump January 6th thing, that is popular. Like it's not popular to say actually Trump won the election. There's nothing to be gained there. Like the people that are, especially the people are going to be appealed to by like a third party to the left candidacy, which I think is a problem here, really, because I think some people would rather be appealing to the Fox News audience. But yeah, anyway.
How Biden is more fascist than Trump.
Trump
just lay it out right quick.
Well, I'll tell you right now, the reason why the deep state Russiagated Trump was because he wouldn't bomb enough to calm them down. So he wouldn't do enough bombing. The reason they impeached him because he wouldn't ship arms to Nazis in Ukraine, and he was against that. So that's
that's not, again. Trump.
It's just like every bit of reporting that we've gotten is the complete opposite. I mean, Trump used the mother of all bombs. Remember that? Just incredibly destructive weapon, a gift to the arms industry. Right? Was somebody who oversaw massive expansion of the arms industry in this country. Right? You want to use words like military industrial complex, and you don't want to talk about the practical effect of them, how they played in American politics while Trump was president. Again, there's a part of this where it's like I'm trying to be patient because it's like we're gonna have to get through this segment, but it's just at every step, and also like the deep state conspiracy, right? Absolutely, I think that it is true that something that happened under the Trump administration is clear, is that like there is like a group of people in the American state who hold a lot of power. Part of that, though, is that Trump was also extremely lazy. And that's why, a lot of like the Trump government was like autopilot Republican policy. It was because Trump didn't want to fucking do it. Trump's not interested in that. He wants to do the rallies. He wants to look tough. He wants to play a certain role. So, all of this kind of weird things where you're like, oh, in Trump's like deep heart, he was fighting against the deep state. And they like thwarted him is nonsensical when you realize that like a lot of the interventions that were happening against Trump or people were pushing him in a certain direction were like, hey, actually, I think a land war in Iran would be extremely devastating for both the Iranians and the Americans.
Yeah, I mean, it's just on like drone strikes themselves. You look at them; Trump massively expanded and also like secretized those programs. But like the raw numbers of like civilian deaths in Iraq and Syria or whatever, it's gross to like be a guy who Jimmy was during the whole Obama administration, joining the chorus against Obama like the left should have been doing, saying this is a evil program, you can't be doing this, and then to be sitting here making this sort of impression, it's gross.
Yeah. Trump is somehow being a person who is I don't understand. I don't stand your argument at this point, though, man. What are we talking about?
Okay, so there's.
I want to understand what the content of your argument is, because one can, in fact, bring critique to bear on the system as a whole with the two corporate wings. But somehow, what do you say to trans and gays and lesbian brothers and sisters in terms of their rights?
So that's again. Joe Biden is responsible for the mass incarceration, not Donald Trump. Who is more responsible for black and brown people being locked up and America being the largest penal colony in the world? Is it Donald Trump or would it be Joe Biden?
Again, like, okay, yes, Joe Biden definitely has a record supportive of mass incarceration within government. Donald Trump was taking out advertisements and also, by the way, supporting all these fucking politicians with his money, but taking out advertisements saying, lock these motherfuckers up. I don't care if there's not evidence, right? Like, that's such like.
What was Trump doing?
Yeah.
Sorry.
What
was Trump doing again when he was the president of the United States? When there were the massive Black Lives Matter protests all across this country, he's talking about get them. right? He was literally on camera saying, you got to get these guys, right? Or, I mean, remember that very famous video of him talking about like how the police are so soft, right? When they have somebody arrested, they protect their head and they lower them into the police cars. Like, I don't think they should protect their head. They should hit them right on the thing. Yeah. So, you know, again, it's just like I'm not confused as to why Jimmy Dore is doing this, but just like you can understand Cornel West's like befuddlement or confusion as to what it is that Jimmy Dore's, because the thing is, Jimmy Dore's like really subtle about it. I mean, like it becomes clear over time, but he never comes out and says like, I think Donald Trump is like the best, right? But it's sort of like, oh, the media hates Donald Trump because he's a free thinker and he doesn't support the two-party system. But yeah, he's the he's like the leader of the Republican Party effectively at this point. Supports the vast majority of their policies, and then when he was president, enacted them with a tremendous speed and efficiency that was brutal on all sorts of working people in this country. I mean, yeah.
When the looting starts, the shooting starts. I got it.
Christian is a loser for your campaign.
Well,
sitting here trying to make the argument.
It could be a loser for you too, though.
Trying to make the argument.
You trying to make the case that somehow the Democrats are more fascist than the Republicans. The fascism cuts across the board. But
that's not how you say it, though. You say it's only Donald Trump. You don't say it cuts across the board. You call Joe Biden milquetoast, and you call Donald Trump a fascist. So you're not saying Joe Biden is a fascist, really?
I said there's fascist dimensions to the Biden project. You're absolutely right.
You know, I want to stop here too. I do think it's important, actually, for people understanding fascism, if this is going to be a political educational moment in an international context, to say that actually what Trump is doing rhymes with what happened in Bolivia, and right, what is a playbook actually. And so I think Cornel West sticking out that position, saying like, actually, this is a type of, if you want to call it neo-fascism, let's call it that needs to be understood as a sort of escalation against democracy as it's constituted under capitalism.
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree. If you want to call Inez and the movement in Bolivia fascist, I mean, Trump literally is trying to overturn the election. There's just no way around it. We've had Danny Bessner on. We've had the debates about like whether or not fascism is a helpful thing. And I don't even know if we have the time or interest to really dive into all that right now. Yeah. But like it
out.
The way that the Jimmy Dore definition of fascism, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be too insulting. It's something you hear all the time. That is just wrong. Fascism is not when the government gets together with corporations to screw over the working people. That's capitalism, right? That's bad policy. Those are forces that we, abhor and we're against. But fascism is a very particular political movement that was utilized by the capitalist class to crush the workers' movement. How? By replacing the nation class with the nation, right? So instead of being an oppressed a worker, you are an oppressed Italian, a member of a great nation who's being held down, right? Fascism is I mean, there's this multidimensional, but like the rhetoric of fascism is one thing that's important, and two, like the way that it's set up, and it's fundamentally against democracy. It doesn't want there to be free and fair elections. And sitting here and saying that a guy who is on recording saying, I need you to find me so many votes so that we can flip the election in my favor, that guy is anti-democratic. And it even ways like I'm just saying this like as somebody who has like said that like I think that sometimes the fascism metaphor doesn't allow people to think strategically, right? And that's why I've sort of like had Bessner on and gone to these arguments.
Right.
Utilizing it to sit here and say that Donald Trump and what he tried to do, for example, in 2020 is not a direct threat to democracy is so ludicrous and so far from what that kind of thing is, especially if you're going to use such a pedestrian argument for what fascism is. I mean, and again, like it's just the segment will never end if we do this every time. But it's like corporations working with the government to crush the worker. We had Trump as the president of the United States from 2016 to 2020. What happened to corporate power when he was the president? It expanded immensely. He literally had oil executives in cabinet positions of the United States government that were supposed to oversee those industries. what are you talking about? That Trump, like, if that is the definition that you're using, right? Which again, I don't think is the best one. That is exactly what happened when Donald Trump was the president. It's just like, you can't create your weird patchwork criteria and then say, oh, actually, it doesn't count for Trump for some reason, because I think that that's going to help my show grow by doing this, bit on my program every week.
It's a deep state, bro.
You're campaigning for Joe Biden almost when you're doing this. That's what it sounds like.
That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous.
But that's what I'm not saying you are doing that. I'm saying that's what it sounds like.
What it sounds like to you. That's what it sounds like to you.
Well,
And you got a right to be wrong. You got a right to be right. It sounds like to you. But it doesn't sound like that to a whole host of others at all, though, brother. Not at all.
All right. Again, I'm saying this out of love for you because I do have deep love for you. I have deep respect for you. And we agree on almost everything except the message of your campaign, right? That's the only thing. I would hope it would become even more focal. Let me just put it this way.
But are you suggesting that the message should be that Biden is a greater fascist than Trump? Is that what you're saying?
I'm not saying that you should talk about fascism or any of that stuff. I think you should.
No, fascism is very real.
I think
you don't think fascism is real in the country?
We're living in it. We're living in fascism.
But I'm talking about escalating in terms of intensity.
It has since Biden became president. It certainly has escalated in intensity. They've censored everybody. They've crushed unions. They've started another war, and now they're saber rattling with 2 nuclear powers. I don't know how I don't know how worse it could get. And by the way, he still hasn't let people out of prison. He still hasn't given student loan. He's still denying us health care. He's an enemy of the worker and a tool of military-industrial complex in Wall Street. There's no bigger fascist in the country than Joe Biden. The reason why black and brown people are locked up again isn't because of Trump. It's because of brother Biden. And Joe Biden is proud of that. He brags about that. He brags about the crime bill, and he will never apologize for it. So I'm just letting you know that I really want your campaign to pick up traction. This is the opposite way to do it. Who's ever advising you sounds like an infiltrator.
But why do you keep saying advise me? I'm thinking for myself, brother. I'm a free
I don't mean to insult
man.
you. That's not
just a question of advising.
Okay.
I don't ask who's advising you. You think for yourself. You're a free man too, aren't you?
You're right. You're right. Okay. I was trying to put it in a nice way.
You don't use that kind of language, my brother. You want to be respectful.
I'm trying to be respectful.
I gotta say, like, this is as contentious as I've seen a Cornel West back and forth. I mean, I'm sure there's been debates and stuff, but usually Jimmy's so out of line with the who is advice, because one, he doesn't understand how Cornel takes that, which is that you don't think I can fucking think for myself. Mm-hmm. And Jimmy's so up his own ass on like, oh, we don't have the inside connect because Nick Brana got outed as crazy. We'll go into his tweets about like how the Green Party has never organized a Rage Against the War Machine type of thing. But like, I mean, that wild, man.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, totally. And like, adding to it is like, it is incredibly insulting to be talking to Cornel West, who is nothing but consistent, right? Yeah. Cornel West hasn't changed his message one bit since when he was a surrogate for Bernie Sanders, since he was a public speaker, author, educator, all these things, to today. So to sit here and say, oh, he's getting bad advice, it's just ludicrous. This is Cornel West playing the hits, right?
Yeah. Actually, what I appreciate about this is like, look, there was that thing he did that op-ed about the DeSantis classics, and to me, like, I understood that as Cornel being participatory in, maybe some people don't feel comfortable with him participating in, which, DeSantis shit with higher ed, absolutely understand why that's a red line. But this, I think, confirms his consistency, that like this is the same guy you saw on C-SPAN in like 1993, like talking about Clinton and I just want to say here, I meant to say up top, Cornel West was absolutely right about Obama and that whole administration being ran by Citibank executives. And he was right to do it. And just because he like did some higher education thing, is on some board, doesn't make him any less right about that. And to me, I saw Cornell, Minnesota State University Moorhead, and it was like he opened up the boundaries of like what I knew to be political thought. And it helps that he is anthologized in lots of things too, because Cornel West has a long track record that people could check, and if they did check this, instead of just getting on a fucking Jimmy Dore show, youtube.com/TYT comedy, if they didn't just get on there to live stream and maybe read some of his books, they wouldn't be, blindsided when this guy talks about white supremacy.
No, I think you're right.
Here's the final, here's that discussion.
Like hard sometimes, but I appreciate it. But we just have disagreements on these things.
Again,
if I undermine the campaign for you, then you're free to have your own view and vision, and people are free to listen to you and be persuaded or not. And I've got mine. I'm listening for your insight. Absolutely right. No doubt about that.
So let me just say this. So the point of running a third-party campaign is to offer an alternative to the two major parties, to bring together disaffected members of those parties, along with independents and others who feel alienated from the political system as it exists. And the best way to do this is by running on economic issues that unite us, but which neither major party is willing to address because they're both beholden to the same powerful corporate interests. The Democratic Party long ago abandoned the working class in favor of beating the drum on cultural issues, and now that's all the Democrats have to run on. So if voters are looking for a party running on trans rights and calling Donald Trump,
again, I'm sorry to keep cutting in, but this is generally true of Democrats. Absolutely, that's a general shift over the decades that we've seen. But the fact is, in certain states, they're rolling back right to work. They're passing things like school lunches. Like it's something that Cornel West can't ignore if he's appealing to the people that are actually been pushing those sorts of things.
It is just so historically wrong, too, right? Because as somebody who makes the argument all the time that we need to be talking about capitalism and building up these kind of movements, do you think the Communist Party of the United States was villainized not just because of their economic platform, but because they oppose segregation, right? The Southern Tenant Farmers Union, the same. So this idea that basically what a socialist or a left-wing movement should do is to sort of ignore these kind of things, to not participate in those fights, is wrong. The criticism of what the Democratic Party is that it plays this dance with the Republican Party, right? Because the Republican Party does culture war stuff too, viciously, right? But it does this because it knows that it's a part of politics that they can do a lot of harm to people. They can sort of say, look what we did, and not touch, for example, capital, right? So the things that you're really mad about, look, we're waging war on your neighbor. Look, we did something for you, right? Evil calculation. That's what that kind of thing is. So being able to rise out of that and support people and to fight against those systems that are oppressing folks, be they trans people, black people, etc., while also building a movement that is focused, not just focused, but is pointed at those systems, right? Recognizing that the attacks on queer people, the attacks on black people also have a starting point in the need of the capitalist class, be they for the argument of sort of dividing working people against each other, to being able to exploit people at higher rates, to put people in a closet, right? Just you was talking about old thing, not having a tolerant society and being able to dig up dirt on your employees and to be able to blackmail them with oh yeah, we're going to let everyone know that you're gay, right? That is a tool that capitalists want to have, right? So taking that weapon away from them is an important improvement in society, right? It's moral on its first place. So that's why you do it first. But the idea that these things are unattached is what I'm getting at. Right. It's just wrong. And it's ahistorical because it's not how these movements that we sort of highlight today as saying oh, wow, look at the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. They were able to organize an interracial union in the South because they were uniting people on the common struggle. And in that common struggle, there was a realization of the importance of fighting against white supremacy and the importance of fighting against racism, right? And you can plug and play that throughout history and the kind of left. What the Democratic Party tries to do is they try to abstract these kind of issues, right? So these fight racism is some kind of force that people are born with. No, it is something that was a product of exploitation and is maintained because it helps out exploitation, right? So yeah, it's not about rejecting fights against racism or fights against attacks on women and queer people and trans folk. It's about rerouting those in the power systems in this country, why these kind of bigotries are led to exist. So like this whole it's so harmful on multiple fronts, the kind of arguments that Jimmy Dore is going to make as this video goes on. One, because like what the implication here is to like let those things slide, right? Which also makes it really cynical when you talk about the effect of those things in relationship to Joe Biden. If you're saying we shouldn't worry about them, absurd. So it's harmful because you're saying turn your back on things. It's also extremely harmful because, again, it muddies the water from the socialist and progressive case. I'll focus on the socialist one as to why and how we root these things in the fight so that they don't just become campaign and fundraising issues for the Democratic Party, or they don't just become the concerns of people in power wanting to see a more diverse boardroom. Like we want to get to the root of white supremacy and racism and all these kind of hatreds and bigotry in this society. And to do that, you have to recognize that Chase Bank is not your friend, that Chase Bank benefits from these things and they can do all the kind of boardroom reshuffles that they want. They benefit from the system of exploitation of people in this country, and all of those other bigotries are tied into it. And so what Jimmy Dore does is he muddies the water because then somebody can watch this Jimmy Dore clip, right, or the other ones and say, oh, this is when people are talking about fighting for workers' rights. This is what they're saying. Right. So it's harmful on a full spectrum because of what he's advocating. And then also, he becomes a false poster child or somebody who's, oh, well, look, I heard somebody made that argument. Look how stupid it is. Right. That's bad as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll get into, I think, more of this.
White supremacists, they can already vote for Democrats. The role of a third party is to focus not on the identity politics that divide us, but on core economic issues that unite us along class lines, like Christian Smalls did at Staten Island. Do you think he led with LGBTQ trans rights and white supremacy, or do you think he organized along class lines?
You know what he did lead with, and I think he probably should invoke Chris Smalls and let him fight his own battles. But he led with COVID safety. We want to be safe from this virus. Just putting that out there.
What we have to do, you have to organize, meet people where they are.
One last thing, again, like a really cynical invocation of Smalls, and I think that's a good point to remember too. As Jimmy Dore's whole thing with COVID, I'm sure we'll get into later. But also like. Chris Smalls regularly said that Jeff Bezos is scared of a strong, well-spoken black man, right? So to act like he didn't campaign on those kind of things is again just ludicrous. It is just it's not factual.
Putting words into his mouth when he's got his own stuff, like use him as a prop. I think because I don't know. Well, continue here.
Rights and white supremacy, or do you think he organized along class lines? That's what we have to do. You have to organize, meet people where they are. So what is your plan to organize along class lines, or are you going to keep talking about white supremacy and all those identity politics, which are there, not from the ground up, from the top down, to make sure we stay divided? What is your plan to organize along class lines?
Well, I appreciate again the clarity and candor of what you have to say. We have profound disagreements, brother. When I organize around white supremacy, I'm not making some utilitarian calculation. I'm speaking as a black man who comes out of a tradition that's been terrorized and traumatized by white elites. And that does not in any way mean it takes me away from class issues. Class issues are crucial. Class issues are fundamental. But it doesn't mean that I'm putting up with white supremacy. One of the problems is that you get too many folk who want to talk class, and can't say a mumbling word about white supremacy, police brutality, can't say a mumbling word hardly. Or when they do say it, you call it identity politics as if it's not connected to class. I'm hitting these head on. I'm standing with the workers when it comes to strikes. I'm standing with the workers when it comes to greedy bosses. I'm standing with the workers when it comes to obsession with profits and the needs not in any way being satisfied. But I'll never for a minute be silent or not raising my voice in terms of vicious treatment of black people, indigenous people, gay brothers, lesbians, sisters, or trans. It's not an either or. And that's where you and I have a deep, profound disappointment. So if I see, for example, if I watch your show and I notice you hardly say a mumbling word about white supremacy because it's some kind of identity politics and I'm against it, but I don't want to talk about it. I only want to talk about what people hold in common. Well, black people are not going to hold it in common if you don't say a word about white supremacy, but maybe some of your white friends will. So who are you talking about? You're talking about in common. Are you talking about just the majority or what, my dear brother? I will never, ever in a million years not talk about vicious legacies of white supremacy, male supremacy, homophobia, transphobia, and others. But class will always be very much at the center. What brings you and I together is what? Our fundamental solidarity with working classes, not just here, but around the world. But oftentimes when I hear about your show and you say, well, you know, these identity politics issues get in the way. No, it's 100%. Not getting in the way. They're not getting in the way.
100%. They're used by so the Democrats, that's all they have to run on. And when you say that stuff, you just sound like a Democrat because that's all they have. So if
exactly
you
wrong.
need
if the talk about the dignity of black people in the face of vicious white supremacy makes me sound like a Democrat, you got the wrong earplug.
Okay.
You're not listening clearly. Because if you can't hear the critique of Wall Street, if you can't hear the critique of militarism, if you can't hear the critique of his foreign policy in Ukraine, and all you can hear when they talk about white supremacy is identity politics, then something's wrong with your earplug, though, bro. Something's wrong with you. We just have deep disagreement.
Okay.
But
it's disappointing.
It is what it is. You are profoundly disappointing in that sense. But I still love you, brother.
I still love you too. I still love you too.
Oh boy, yeah. I mean, that's the meat right there. I know you got some things to say. I will just say very briefly at the top. It's exactly what Cornel West said, is that, like, you know, if anything, like the argument, Jimmy Dore's politics are extremely lazy, and this critique is extremely lazy, because with the socialist argument, with the argument of like Martin Luther King, remember, as people always point out, is like, you know, the March for Jobs and Freedom, right? And it's like, oh, well, you know, Martin Luther King, you know, was like assassinated because he started talking about class issues. Martin Luther King was a threat because he was merging the fight for racial liberation and racial justice with those class issues. So yes, the Democratic Party and people like that do cynically try to use things, but what do they try to cynically use them? They try to pull those things separate from, like, the class struggle, from the fight against capitalism. And what the socialist intervention is not running away from talking about racism, not running away from talking about gender exploitation, trans, etc. It's actually imbuing them with the critique of capitalism, with the economic argument as well, right? It is just, you know, so to talk about, identity politics means when you talk about racism. No. Identity politics is the way that, like, liberals sometimes try to talk about these things without getting to the economic engine that benefits from these kind of things. And the radical intervention is not, again, to ignore things that say class only, economics only, but actually to bring you know, the class critique into the critique of racism and sexism and etc.
Yeah, you know, there's it's interesting, like and his invocation of the Black Panthers and the Young Patriots, I think, goes to the core of this when he talks about and simplifies that moment of, oh, look, the Panthers allowed some Confederate sympathizers to come in with their racism because they organized along class lines, and that's exactly not what happened. That's exact opposite. The Young Patriots were formed as basically a white formation of the Black Panther Party, to the point where you go to this piece here, the Black Panther Party's 10-point program. I'll share it here, and we'll get a sense of how foregrounded race is. And look, Adolf Reed has a critique of the Black Panther era and some of the identity politics, like sort of strategies and stuff there that is not what Jimmy is doing. But right, like, just to give a sense of the Black Panther Party program, we want freedom, we want power to determine the destiny of our Black community, we want full employment for our people, and very strong emphasis on Black people. The last point I'll draw attention to, we want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace, and as our major political objective, a United Nations supervised plebiscite to be held throughout the Black colony, in which only Black colonial subjects will be allowed to participate. Right? I say all that just to point out the similarities and differences with the Young Patriots program. Patriot Party program, what we demand. We demand freedom. We demand power to determine the destiny of our oppressed white community, says there. Now, folks who aren't familiar with the context of the Black Panther 10-point program won't understand that, A, the first draft didn't include the word white. Subsequent drafts did because it was a direct echoing of the Black Panther program. But I would also draw Jimmy's attention particularly to this 10th, and it might be a little bit small for people to read, so I'll read it out loud, which is 10. We demand an end to racism and the inequality of the sexes as tools of capitalism to divide the people. And what is so disgusting about that invocation is how short shrift and what an insult to the legacies of those people who, and you can get into it in this book, Hillbilly Nationalists, Urban Race Rebels, and Black Power, about the decision to reappropriate consciously that symbol, knowing full well that shit.
You're talking about the Confederate flag.
The Confederate flag.
Yeah.
That we're going to have to explain the shit out of this, and it's actually going to cause a lot of tension. And that American Revolution Part 2, what's conveyed there is a snapshot in time of a very, a fraught process with a lot of different outcomes. And like, it's great. What was great about that moment is what we can appreciate, which is what Fred Hampton saw, which is that when you have highly segregated communities, the appearance of poor whites is almost like, in addition to wanting a full-on international and understanding being different types of nationalities and international outreach, but also poor black people didn't know poor white people existed like that. And we've heard like Milton Alamai say, when he came to America, he saw poor white people for the first time. He's like, damn, didn't know that existed. So like, there is definitely something to draw out of this, but it isn't just that they accepted the racists. No, the literal 10th point of those Young Patriots was end racism and sexism.
No, I mean, it's such a disgusting way to talk about the legacy of the Young Patriots and Fred Hampton and the Black Panthers. And just like really, really briefly, because I think some people might know this and some people might not. This is a movement in Chicago. You have the Young Panthers Party led by the great Fred Hampton, who was so young when he was murdered by the FBI and was doing really incredible work, fundamentally changing politics and building these kind of class movements. They end up getting together with this young group called the Young Patriots, which was predominantly made up of poor whites who had left Appalachia and migrated into Chicago. And they were getting beat down by the daily machine, in similar ways to what black people were facing, and also what Puerto Rican groups and other groups were facing.
Young Lords,
around there. So they got organizers from these different groups together to try to create these groups, right? And like, I almost we should do another segment where we could maybe go more in depth into these kind of things. But a plank of all these things was like anti-racism. So for people who are unfamiliar, Jimmy Dore does all this stuff where he's like, oh, the Black Panthers used to work with racists and white supremacists around class issues. That's not true. The Young Patriots was not a racist organization. It was an explicitly anti-racist organization. The only way that you could come to that conclusion or that understanding is if, instead of reading about it or even watching some of the movies, right, if you don't like to read about it, anything about it, you look at a picture where you see a Confederate flag and you say, oh, well, they're racist. When in fact, as Matt was saying, there were tensions around that. And in fact, they ended up the Young Patriots ended up stop flying the Confederate flag on the advice of Fred Hampton, right? So you just have to be operating from either laziness, which will give them that, or cynical, being truly cynical. And it's an insult, again, to like a real movement where people are getting together and we're fighting against a very corrupt political machine and the police and that system there.
Yeah, exactly. Just to dwell on that a little bit, like, one thing that made at those meetings where they did display the flag that made them not just turn into violence was that previously they'd been alongside the Black Panthers doing security or doing their own clinics for free for their communities, right? Actually building up fucking credibility, not being online, chasing Bitcoin or fucking Ron DeSantis or, talking about how trans people are pathological, right? They were actually doing shit. So that's the other thing that I think people should keep in mind with that.
Because I'll just say this about Jimmy Dore and this entire little group. I don't even want to call it a movement because it's such a non-factor. I think I mean certainly right on the political stage, but where it is harmful, I think, is because a lot of people do get their information from online, particularly a lot of young people or older folks. I shouldn't even say just young people who might for whatever reason decide right now is the time I want to get in and start learning about the world and having a better rooted understanding. Very likely that the stuff you're going to interact with early on is going to be, Jimmy Dore, because he's been riding the YouTube algorithm for a little while now. And what's endlessly frustrating is, like, in addition to all of the nastiness and the things that we just sort of showed in that clip, is that at the fundamental level, it is some of the laziest politics, right? And just because I can't go into all of like the problems with the things that he's saying, or the what he's saying about like ignoring racism and all those kind of stuff, right? It's fundamentally lazy because instead of actually thinking, where are we right now and how do we build power, it's this idea that you're just going to like put together the right string of words and you're just going to have a movement sort of delivered to you whole cloth, right? That if you just do a little bit of Trump stuff and a little bit of online leftism, you're going to be able to build a movement. Sorry, that's not how it's ever going to work. The real stuff actually takes going out, building up, not just like having good arguments, but actually starting to deliver for people. And to be able to do that, you have to be rooted in people's everyday struggles. And the way that Jimmy Dore talks about these things, for somebody who says, what we need to do is unite people, somebody who's regularly attacked unions, regularly attacked Starbucks workers, regularly attacks young people, right? He jumps right into all the kind of conservative tropes about the blue hair chick or whatever, right? And this is somebody who's made it very clear that he wants to be a divider, right? And not even just a divider on like the rich versus the poor, on like a certain kind of more right-friendly working class member versus like somebody who might be more left-leaning, right? Look, that's not uniting. That's not doing any kind of real political work. And like the idea, the basically like the Jimmy Dore thesis, and a lot of people like that, is that we don't have to do the difficult thing of building a movement. We can just sort of pick different groups from existing movements, and then we'll have a majority. That's just never going to be how politics works, right? And this is something that I have to tell socialists all the time, people who aren't even doing the cynical stuff that Jimmy Dore is doing, right? Not even getting into that, but the idea that like we're just going to string together the right words or have the right platform and everybody's going to come running to us. No, I'll just tell a brief story from the Southern Tenant Farmers Union map. And they'll have a piece coming up in Jacobin on it soon, and it's a true inspiration because it's a story of poor Southerners, black and white, in the throes of the brutality of the aftermath of the plantation system and its reclamation, right? Its revival, right? Which is the tenant farming system. So the vast majority of Southerners have no money. They don't have any ability, to acquire property on their own. So they end up going and working for these big plantation and landowners. It's an absolutely brutal system of forced debt, right? People were just indebted. Literally, if you try to leave these plantations, if you were in debt, the riding bosses, who oftentimes were the deputy sheriff of the area, would come and pull you back onto the plantation. This is in 1920, 1930, right? 70 years, after the Emancipation Proclamation and the supposed end of this kind of system, still very much rhyming with the plantation system. The point is, like, these were people at the bottom of the economic heap. And for years, people had tried to fight back and were brutally put down. There was a very famous massacre in Arkansas called the Elaine Massacre, where around 200 Black people were murdered for trying to do this kind of organizing. So people were understandably fearful of doing union organizing at this time. People in the Socialist Party get together and decide that, what, it's time for us to build a movement that can fight and advocate for these kind of workers. And they do so on a purposeful interracial plank, right? Fighting for these economic rights. But you know what, Matt? Just like to sort of put some trouble in it for the people who say, like, you can just do the class and the economic thing and not get into the other stuff. Well, they got a lot of support up front, right? But people are facing this brutal system. I mean, literally, the law in the town was also your boss, right? People had the living memory of just 15 years before a brutal massacre of 200 people. And yes, they did get a lot of people, both Black and white, joining up in the union at first. But do you know what changed the game? When they expanded into a neighboring county, the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, that was really, really rampant with brutality and racism and all this kind of stuff. They sent two organizers, right? A white minister and a black minister down there. They hold a meeting. The plantation bosses and the night riders show up, brutalize the meeting. The white minister is able to escape, and the black minister is beaten and held in prison. The STFU gets together and they send in members of the union to show up in court, white members of the unions to show up in court, and they get this black minister out of prison. And that was a critical moment in the development of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, because you know what it showed people? All of this talk about unity and brotherhood was true. That your white members and the people in the union, they were going to show up for a black member just like they would show for anybody else. And when they were talking about these things, it was true. If you take the kind, and look, there were plenty of people who in the early days, right, white people who were saying we shouldn't do an interracial union, it's going to be too difficult. And also a lot of them for like nasty reasons of like not wanting to organize with black people. They were beaten out of the union, right? And it was because of this ability to show solidarity and actually show up and risk life and death for black people who were facing, yes, attacks on their rights as workers, but also rights on their humanity by a system of white supremacy and institutionalized racism and all of this kind of stuff. And that's what changed the game for the STFU. That's what allowed it to be this great class organization that, you know, fundamentally changed the South in that fight. You know, so all of these kind of arguments that you get from these people it's just false. It's ahistorical, and it's not how you do it. You can have an organization that fights for working class power and also fights against white supremacy. And Lord help us all. I mean, that's a difficult time to do it. So to sit here and say that somebody talking about mass incarceration and all these other things are identity politics issue, you would be on the other side of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, right? You would be on the other side of the Black Panthers and the Young Patriots, of the Communist Party, of the Socialist Party. You know, you could go ad nauseum throughout like these left things. It is just false, this kind of dichotomy that people like Jimmy Dore put forward.
Yeah. And sorry it offends your fan base, Jimmy.
Yeah, which is the real crime, ain't it?
Yeah. That's pretty much.